In this module, we're going to talk about gateways or decision points in the process. Gateways are diamonds, and there are different types of gateways that we can put into our process definitions. And gateways basically direct the sequence flow. They determine which path or paths the process is going to take. Generally, at this point in the process, when we transition from one step into the gateway evaluates information. It may evaluate a deadline, it may evaluate a variable piece of data, so something that someone entered into the form or some variable that's been systematically set. And it evaluates that, and based on the rules in the gateway, will determine if it should branch down one or multiple paths in the process. Let's take a look at some different examples. First, let me define the different types of gateways that you can incorporate into a model, and then we'll take a look at some examples. The first is an exclusive gateway, or XOR gateway. And an exclusive gateway allows any of the incoming paths to activate the gate. So if there are 3 paths coming into the gate, any one of those paths may activate the gate. Once the gate is activated, this decision is evaluated, and dependent upon which of the paths that are outgoing are satisfied, or the condition is satisfied, it will take one of those paths, but can only take one of the outgoing paths. The inclusive gateway, or an OR gateway, can also have multiple paths coming into the gateway, and it will wait for any number of those paths to come in essence synchronize and wait for those paths to converge. And then once the number of expected paths coming in have converged, the gate then is activated. And again, once the gate is activated, it'll evaluate the outgoing conditions, and those that are satisfied, it will take all of the paths in this case that are satisfied. A complex gateway uses a decision, and it can use a decision or decision to determine which of the incoming paths would activate the gate, and which decision would then determine which of the outgoing paths would be taken. And then lastly, an AND gateway, or a parallel gateway. And this gateway waits for all paths to come in, and it will take all outgoing paths. So depending upon the kind of process you're trying to model and what the decision logic is, you're going to determine which of these gateways is appropriate to use. Let's take a look at a few examples, and then we'll add a gateway into our process. Let's take a look first at an exclusive gateway. So here we have an exclusive or an XOR gateway, and my intention in this gateway is for the process to branch down only one of these 2 possible paths. The gateway could have one or more incoming paths. In this case, we have just one incoming path, and then we have 2 possible outgoing paths. And if we look at the rules on the gateway, we see that there's just one inflow or incoming flow path, and so there's no conditions or rules on that path because there's only one path that's going to come in. And now we see on our outgoing flow we have 2 possible paths, and each of those has different conditions. So in the first path, if the outcome is stock, if there's a field in the form and it's selected that it's stock, it's going to branch down this path in the process. In this case, it could be any of the following. So if outcome is either return or return as is or refurbish, any of those conditions is going to drive it down the ship RMA part, wherein the first is going to put the RMA back into inventory. Now, if I had a situation where I might have some parts that in fact need to be returned to inventory and some parts are going to be shipped back, then the gateway that I would choose to use here would be an inclusive gateway. Because with an inclusive gateway or an OR gateway, I would have the ability using this gateway to either send it to one path or the other, or both. So I can have multiple paths coming in, but I can also have multiple paths going out simultaneously. Now let's take a look at a complex gateway. And with a complex gateway, again, we can use a decision to activate the gate and a decision to determine which path or branch to go down once we've evaluated the rules of the gateway. Here's a complex gateway, and I want to branch down one of these processes based on the rules or decision that's made. So in this gateway, there's a decision condition capability. And here what you can see is you can have very complex and or conditions, and I have multiple paths. So here are my paths in the process, and you can see I can either branch to the effectuation, I can branch to store documents, and so on. And these are the various rules that I can use or I'll evaluate to make a determination as to which path to take. And an AND gateway, which I don't happen to have an example of, but when you use an AND gateway, if I wanted to wait for multiple paths to converge before I move forward, so if I were to have taken 2 or 3 of these paths, then I could use the AND gateway to link all of those paths coming in, and it would then wait for all of those paths to converge and then take the appropriate outbound path. And with the AND gateway, if you have several outgoing paths, they're guaranteed to all be taken. So not only will the gateway wait for any number of incoming paths, every path will be taken, guaranteed, on the outbound flow. Another thing that I'll just point out with gateways is the idea of a default path. As you can see in this process, there's a slashed line that corresponds to this particular path in the flow. And what that slashed line indicates is that that is the default path. So when you define the rules on the outgoing flow, you can specify a particular path as the default. So what you can see here is that this path was specified as the default. And what it lets me do is it simplifies the rules in that anything other than the conditions that are being defined in these paths should go down this path by default. The other thing I'll mention about gateways or decisioning, another way that you can do decisions in BizFlow is by simply setting that condition on the outgoing flow of the activity. So one thing you'll notice here on this particular activity is that there are diamonds coming off of the outgoing paths of this activity. If you look at this activity, you don't see that type of diamond. And I'll show you one other one. Let's see here. Now you see that these all have diamonds. So what these are showing is that these are conditional paths. So this has 3 possible paths or outgoing flows that could occur from this activity. And you could use a decision point, or you can simply define those conditions directly on the activity itself. So how you choose to set up your outgoing or inbound conditions is really up to you. Let's add a gateway now to our first online process. What we want to do is add a gateway to this process to indicate that once the employee completes the form, based on the time off request type, we're going to either route it to the manager, or we're going to first route it to an HR function, which in turn will then route it to the manager. For this purpose, we're going to use an exclusive gateway. We have just one path that's going to come into our gateway. And while we're going to have 2 possible paths that we can go out of, we only want one of those paths to be possibly taken. We're going to add another activity into our map. And we're going to link the gateway to both activities. So now what will happen is when we reach the gateway, and we can just call this decision, we're going to evaluate the process variable that we created for time off type. And if time off type is equal to maternity, and we're going to put that in quotes because it's a string, then we're going to send it to activity 1. Whoop. And anything else is going to simply be our default path. And we'll make activity 1 HR manager. Approves request. And once the HR manager completes that, they can then in turn send it to the manager to be reviewed. And if we want to visually make this a little easier to follow, I can show that both paths are coming in. Now when our employee completes the form and they submit it, if they choose maternity, it's going to first go to the HR manager to be approved. And once that manager approves it, it can then go to the employee's manager for a final approval. If, of course, we wanted to be technically accurate, we would probably want to have some type of disapprove also go back to the employee from our HR manager. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to keep it as the model is right now. So of course we're going to check our model back in and then republish the model. And as we've done before, we'll go to our web client and start the process. And we'll fill out the fields, and in this time around we're going to select maternity as our option. We're going to see the manager approves request. Now, something doesn't seem right. We were expecting this to go to the HR manager. Again, if we look at our process, the path, the default path was going to be to go to the manager unless it was maternity, and if it's maternity, then we should be going to the HR department. So what happened? Why did it branch to the manager approves? Well, one of the things we have to remember is that it's evaluating the data that's being passed by the form. Now, in this particular case, our form happens to use a pull-down menu for the time off type. And when this form was designed, there's the value that the form is saving and the value that is being displayed in the field. And these are actually two different things. A lot of times you might be using a database and there's an ID, which is the value of that particular field, and then the display value, what's actually being shown to the user. So what's really being saved here, and how can I figure that out? So one of the tools, and you'll use this a lot when you're designing BizFlow processes, is the monitor lets you see the data. So let's go ahead and go to the monitor. And here's the process that we're working with. 307 is the ID. We could take a look at that and we could monitor it as we've done in the past, and we would see the flow progression and the audit history and what's transpired. So we can say that it in fact took the default path, which we know is inaccurate. But what we can also do is we can view the data. And viewing the data is going to let us see the variables that were saved on this process. So when the person filled out the form, these are the variables that are being saved with the process. And what do we see for time off type? M, So what's actually being saved when the person selects maternity is M. If they select other, it's O, and so on. So that's the value that's being saved, not necessarily the value that the user is seeing. To correct this, we would then have to go and correct our rule on our process. So what we really want is of course we have to check the process out, and what we really want for this value to be is M. And so we can modify that rule and save the process, check the process back in, republish the process, and test the process again. Now, when we start the process and fill out the form and submit it, it should go to our HR manager. Then you can see that now the process is taking the correct path. So again, this is very typical when you're using select fields. You could in fact make the value for both the display and the saved value the same, but generally there's some type of ID that's being saved when you're using lookup values.